Hello and welcome. In this tutorial, we are going to be using spline-based modeling techniques to create a squid. And it's going to be a squid kind of based on a cartoonish style of a squid. And it's really to teach these tools. We're going to make it as simple as we possibly can in order to learn how to use some of the great generators that allow us to do more organic or curvilinear modeling using splines. And so I'm just on the Adobe stock page. I haven't even logged in yet. I'm not going to worry about that right now. We're just using this as a very basic reference, and then we're going to kind of build from it. But just so if you haven't looked up images of squid recently, and I specifically searched for a cartoon squid, but you'll note that there's this like kind of head, varying different types of like fin extrusions on the tops of their head, I guess you would call it, or body. And then usually there's like the face, because all squids have eyes like this, right? And tentacles. And we're going to be looking for examples where we don't necessarily need to have the tentacles smoothly transition into the rest of the body. And that's because the techniques I'm going to show you, we're not going to get to the point in this tutorial of making those smooth transitions. That's a little bit trickier. There's a lot more that needs to go into that to make that happen effectively. But for our purposes, we're going to be able to develop something that looks pretty good with a couple and we're going to do a couple tricks, right? This is something else, when you start thinking about the logic and the process of 3D modeling, you always need to be like, what's going to be seen? How detailed does this need to be? Where can I cheat in order to make this look good from the angle I'm going to be shooting it, or how am I going to make sure that this fits my needs without being any additional work that doesn't need to be done, right? 3D modeling is tedious, and you need to put your efforts where they're most useful for what you're working on. So in this case, there's one particular squid in here. You'll notice there's a bunch that have these like smooth transitions. And again, I said for what we're working with and how we're working, that's not what we want. We want something that's going to be a little bit more, honestly, like this one, which I'll show you later, but it's because it's so dark, it's kind of hard to see all the detail in there. But I've already selected this little one here. And the reason I chose this as my reference, we're not going to make anything that looks, remotely similar to this. But the reason that I chose this as my reference is because, right, there's the main section of the body. The eyes are on the body. There's the fins up there. But then there's this little skirt here, and the tentacles come out from below there. And that means that there's this nice seam where we can have multiple objects here that create this one cohesive model. And the techniques I show you, we won't need to worry about any of those seams coming through. So we're going to use this as a very rough reference. Okay, so let's go ahead and pop over to Cinema. And you'll see I already started here. I am going to delete all of this, and we're going to get going again. Okay, so up until this point, we've used primitives to make 3D shapes. So the other main way of modeling, other than polygon modeling, which we will do next, is to use splines as the basis. And a spline is basically just a path. It's a set of points and a line connection between them. And so if I just go ahead and create a circle, you'll see that, right, it's just this orange circle. And if I rotate my view around, you can see it's two-dimensional, right? It's just currently aligned to the XY plane. If I select my circle in my hierarchy and go down to my Attributes Manager and select the Object tab, you'll see I have several options here. I can set the radius. I can say this is an ellipse, which then gives me 2 radii, and I can then stretch and shrink these things. And you'll note, oh, maybe this would actually be a good way to do, to have done the archways for the tower that we did previously, and that is true. It could be a very useful way to do that. But we are going to, we're actually going to just leave this as a circle right now. You can also do a ring, right? So I can get 2 circles, and so I could make tubes and other things like that as well. And then you can choose which plane you want it to be in. Do I want it to be in the XY plane, the XZ or the ZY plane, or the XZ plane. Right. In our case, because we're going to be building this squid, vertically, we're going to want to put our splines in the XZ plane. And reverse, you're going to look at that. You're going to be like, what does that do? Right now, it doesn't do anything interesting for us. And then it talks about intermediate points and the number. And again, right, we can increase or decrease the radius of the spline. And if I hold down this button, you'll see there's a bunch of presets or sort of like primitive spline things. There's cogwheels, flowers, stars. You can actually like put mathematical formula in and do that. There's this empty spline. There's one called profile, cycloid, cissoid, right? There's just a bunch of possible options here. We're predominantly going to be using, for this little first start, we'll use the circle and the flower. So I'm going to create a circle. I'm going to go ahead and create a flower. And you'll see the flower has these lobes and kind of looks already like, if you imagine what we're going to do to start with is we're going to be using the Loft generator. And the Loft generator basically allows us to use splines as essentially like a cross section, and then it stretches a skin between these different cross sections, and we can have, as far as I know, as many of these as we want in order to create this shape. You can imagine it like if you've ever been in a boat or like a tent or something like that, right? The splines are basically the tent poles, and the loft is the fabric of the tent wrapped around those poles. So we're going to go ahead and use these two to start with. And so the flower, right, currently is in the wrong orientation. So we want to put that in the XZ as well. And we're just going to leave everything at the default settings currently. And then what we're going to do is we're going to create our loft. And to create a loft, we go to where it says subdivision surface. This is our main generator menu. We're going to come down, we're going to go to loft, and you can see that icon shows like a square and then a circle with like the green stretched between it. It's showing us what it does, right? So we have our loft and we have our flower and we have our circle. And so we want to make the flower and the circle children of this. And you'll see immediately I get geometry here and it's all flat and smushed, right? And so what a loft does is it goes down and it takes this as our first. This is where the loft starts, and then it's going to be stretched to here. And if we have more, it will continue down, right? One of the issues people tend to have with the loft is they'll get the things out of order. And then and I'll show you what happens then, but your skin is going really in the wrong ways. So to start with, what I'm going to do to make this so we can see what's going on is I'm going to select the circle. And I'm going to use the Move tool, which is already selected, but if not, you can hit the letter E, or you can click on the Move tool there. And I'm going to go ahead and drag this up a little bit, right? Because this is going to be the top, right, of my model. And so you can see, right, as I drag this up, I'm at the top of my skirt. I'm starting to get right, geometry. I've got like a solid object that starts as a star on one side and ends in a circle on the other. Now, if I select the flower and I turn the loft off, you'll see, right, this is what my flower looks like, but you'll notice that it's really sharp here, right? There's very little going. It's not mapping any of those things. It's really just taking the point that's at the edge, at the top of that curve, and that's all it's using. And the reason for this is not because of the number of segments or subdivisions for my flower or my circle, but it's because of the number of subdivisions on my loft. And so if I select the loft, you'll see that there's subdivisions in the U and subdivisions in the V, and you're like, what the heck are U and V? We'll get into this later when we talk more about textures, but U and UVs are basically, they're mapped to, right, the X, Y, Z coordinates on the surface of an object, right? So there's a UV polygon that is the same for each one of these. But what UVs do is it's a two-dimensional, basically a two-dimensional image that you wrap around a three-dimensional space. And so the UVs, it's just another way of describing that space. we don't need to talk any more about it right now than that. But for whatever reason, this tool uses U and V as the directions. And so and I'm like, well, which one's U and which one's V? In this case, it's reasonably obvious because where it says subdivision V is 4, right? That means there's 1, 2, 3, 4. This is the V. The subdivision U is the 16. So much like we did previously, if we increase this number and I just start cranking this up, you'll see that I start to get that a much smoother thing. And if I actually pull this all the way up to 100, then I'm going to get a reasonably smooth thing. Now, 100 isn't the maximum. It's just the maximum of the slider. And it's something weird that Cinema4d does, but I could put in 255 in here, right? And I'm going to get 255, and you'll see I get this little bit of orange over there, basically saying I've like gone beyond the end of my thing. And you can type in, I don't know, there's some number that will be a maximum. I'm not sure what that is. But right, depending on how smooth you need this surface to be, you can set that. Now, there's another tool we're going to use that we'll look at and see what it does when we apply it to this object. So I'm going to set this to 100, right? I don't need that many polygons. Okay, so some other settings. We don't really need this. I don't want the caps on here. There's a cap on the top, there's a cap on the bottom, and you'll see the bottom looks weird and wobbly. And that weird and wobbliness is going to be gone when we use the caps. So I have my object tab set. Now you'll notice that when I came into this at first, both of these were highlighted and I actually had more settings. What you can do is you can just hold down Shift and you can actually click and you can have like multiple tabs all laid out in order in this, which is really handy if there's like multiple, like instead of switching between object and coordinates, you can just have your coordinates and your object properties all in one. It's one of my favorite like little features and usability things. Okay, so I've got per segment checked. If I uncheck per segment, you'll see that it makes some adjustments. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Organic form, if I check mark that, you'll see that there's a subtle change in where these edges are. And because this is an organic form, we probably want organic form check marked. We're not going to worry about loop right now. Linear interpolation, we're not going to worry about that either. And if I check mark reverse normals, you'll see that what that does is, and we don't know what normals are yet, but it flattens this out, and that top surface is still good too. However, we don't need to worry about any of that because what we're going to do is we're going to go to our caps. I'm going to hold down Shift so this is open at the same time. And I'm going to uncheck start and uncheck end. Because, right, all we really need is for this to be a skin. Right, we're not going to be making something that's like, you know, crazy complex in terms of, or we don't need that thickness. Okay, so I've got these two shapes. And really, I don't want the skirt to fall in like that. I'm going to want it to flare out. So what I do is I select my flower. I'm going to hit the letter T or click over here for the scale tool. And right, I don't want to do a single axis at once. I'd like to do both axes at the same time here. So I hover over this green triangle so I can do the XZ at the same time. And if I click and drag, and you'll figure out which direction pretty quickly, I can start to flare this out. Okay, so I've got it flared out some. I'm not, again, this is pretty freehand. If you want to know how big this is now, you can say, right, I can see that if I go to the coordinates tab, everything's there, but my object, it's 169 on the inner radius, 338 on the outer radius. I can stretch that out more. I could make my inner radius, right? You can see that if I shrink these things, this flower shape changes a lot. And really, those are things you can just determine, you know, how you want those to be set. In terms of scale, I don't know how big I just scaled it, but we do know that this is 200. I do think I'm going to leave this set to 200. It's a good even value. Okay, so I've got these two. So now what I want to do is I'd rather than this just truncating here, that I know from experience that if I the skirt's going to be its own object, and I'm going to have the body be an object and the tentacles come out from below. And I know from experience, if I just have this hard edge here, then it's going to look really weird. And there might be a point where, depending on where your camera is located, you're going to be able to see between the two models and there will be a gap in there. And we don't want that to happen. So we're going to add a couple more cross sections. So I have my circle here and I know it's already here. It's the settings that I want. So I'm going to copy and paste this. Now I'm not going to use Control or Command C and V to do that, but I am going to hold down the Control key, and this is Control for Windows and Mac. And I'm going to click on the object in my hierarchy and drag. And when I do that, it's going to create a new copy of the same object. And if you notice, there's this little white line where if I scoot over a little bit, it goes longer or shorter. When it's shorter, that means it's going to drop that copy as a child of the loft, whereas this is going to be, right, it would actually just be we'll call it a sibling of the loft, right? But what I want to do is I want to drop it as a child under this other circle, right? If for some reason you can't do that, it's like being super obnoxious. And so you actually, I'm going to undo that. So let's say we actually drop it here. Not all is not lost. You just go ahead, make this a child of the loft, and you'll see something, you'll notice a change immediately. And that's because what's happened is I now have this in the wrong order. Remember, the flower is the bottom edge, but right now it's one circle is the bottom edge, then it's the flower, then it's the circle. So what I need to do is I need to drag this circle just down in the order until it's there, right? Okay, so now that I've done that, what I want to do is I want to create like a lip that comes in, and then I'm basically going to go in a little bit and then down, all right? So then we can set the other model in there, almost like it, like if you had a sphere and you had some sort of cup that it could fit into. It's kind of the same idea there. So now that I've done that, I'm still going to keep my scale tool active. I'm just going to scale this circle in a little bit. I could also, instead of using scale, right, you'll notice even though I'm using scale, what it's adjusting is my radius. If you look over in the attributes, which is exactly what I want it to do. So I've scaled that down some, so you can see that now I've got this, it's like a flat surface. I know from experience, if I go ahead and move this right now, if I hit E on the keyboard or click over here, I can drag this down, but it's going to make like a much harder edge. And what I'd like is to have like basically one more cross section, so I have like a bit more freedom and I can adjust things later in order to like make sure the fit looks good and I'm not limiting myself. So I'm going to go ahead and I've got this circle set. I'm going to hold down Control, click and drag, make sure it's that short white line, drop it in there. And now I can just pull this down for now. And I could probably scale it in a little bit too. So if I hit the letter T and I could either snug it out like that, or actually I probably want it to just taper in just a little bit more. Okay, so now I've got the skirt finished for now, right? This is probably about all I want. And so I want you to notice a few other things that are happening here, right? I have a lot more geometry where my cross sections are closer together, right? If I turn this off, you can see these are my 3 cross sections here and then the 4th one, right? And these are all a lot closer together. So the geometry is much more dense where there's more transformation happening. And so if I come down, if I select my loft and go down here, you can see there's this adapt UV option. If I uncheck that, sometimes that will make some changes. In this case, it didn't seem to do anything. If I check mark adapt, like reverse normals, nothing really changes there that we can notice at this point. If I check mark loop, you'll notice something a major change occurs. And what that means is that what the loop does is it basically takes and wraps this around. So it connects the first child of the loft with the final child of the loft, right? And so you can kind of get thickness that way. So this model actually, even though it comes to this hard edge here, it actually gets a little bit of thickness. Now, if I wanted to give it you know, if I wanted to fix that edge a little bit, I could take my flower, hold down Control, click and drag, create another copy, right? And now those two copies are exactly the same size and on top of each other. But let's say I want like a little bit of thickness on the edge of this skirt. I know this orientation is probably weird and disorienting, but I've rotated down below the model. I'm doing the same thing, hovering over here, and I'm going to shrink this down. And you can see now I'm actually getting some thickness to this. All right, so I've actually created like a three-dimensional model using just the loft and a few splines. So we're going to go ahead and leave it set like that. That's going to make it so that if we do peek under here, we've got some thickness and we're in a pretty good spot. So let's go ahead and select our loft, double click on the name, and we're going to call this skirt for lack of a better word, because that's kind of what it looks like. Now that I've got this skirt set, I can click this minus symbol here, and then it shrinks everything up. It doesn't take up much space in the hierarchy. Now I want to do, the next thing I'm going to do is the body. So we're going to do the body basically the same way, but we're going to need to do some editing once we get a little bit closer to being done. So we are going to, right, if we take a look at this, right, we're going to have this main body, and we're not going to have these be separate objects. They're going to be one unified chunk, because that's going to allow me to show you how to start to edit points on a spline, right? This will be the first time when we can actually individually manipulate a part of the shape that we're making. So yeah, so we're going to work on this body part. We're not going to worry about eyes, and we're definitely not going to do a mouth for this model. It's just going to be eyes, because the mouth on a squid is actually right up here in the tentacles. So there's no reason they should be smiling, right? They just have a beak and they eat things. All right, so we are going to start working on this body. Now we could start to align things here and leave the skirt visible, which we'll do for now. And if we need to, we can turn that visibility off. And in the previous tutorials, I've just been having you uncheck this, right? But you can see that I still see those splines, and that's kind of obnoxious. If I want to hide everything, I can click on, there's these two little gray dots here. If I click on this one once, it means it's going to be visible, which is the default method, default behavior. But if I click on it again and it turns red, everything disappears. The second one, and we haven't talked about rendering, but this is whether it should be visible in the renderer or not. And in this case, right, if I was to render this, which you can render to the viewport just hitting Command or Control R. And it's going to take a second because it is doing Redshift is the default render engine. And so it looks kind of weird, but right. So I'm actually rendering this with, you know, the default light and no shadows or anything like that. And it looks like hot garbage right now, but that's fine. So, right. But so when I render it, it still shows up. But if I then just click here, right, it's disappeared. So we're going to leave this visible for now so we can start to align things. So let's go ahead and let's create another circle. We're going to, right, set this to XZ so it's flat. I'm going to use the move tool to move it vertically. And right, the body starts out much smaller in diameter. So I want it to actually kind of maybe match where this inner ring is. So I'm going to go ahead and switch my view to this top view, because that's going to make it so much easier to get it somewhat close. Now, another option is I could have selected one of those circles, copied it and pasted it and used it as my base. But just for more experience twisting things, we're going to go ahead and do this. And so I've switched to scale, and I'm going to go ahead and click this corner and scale this thing in until it's more or less the same size as that base circle. And you'll see that I have it kind of level with the top here. Eventually we're going to set it down inside so that it matches the way I said. But for now, we're going to leave it right here. And then let's go ahead and create our loft, and we'll make this a child of the loft. So I'm going to go to Loft, make this circle a child, and now we get this beautiful disk. And I'm going to go ahead and hit Control, click and drag down to create another copy. Hit the letter E for the move. You can start to see why quick keys are useful because, right, if I kept going back and forth across the entire screen, that would start to be pretty obnoxious. And so I'm going to go ahead and lift this up a reasonable amount, maybe to here. Let's go ahead and look at our 4 views. Great. And I'm having all 4 views up now because it's kind of useful sometimes to be able to look at how things are changing in all directions. So I'm going to go ahead and scale this now. So I'm going to hit the letter T, and I'm going to go ahead and scale this body out a little bit, right? And I could set this to be, right, whatever, maximum width I want this to be at this point, because it gets pretty, it swells, right? It plumps out at the bottom and then tapers at the top. So I have this one currently set to like 255 centimeters is the radius, right? And the original one is 200. And I'm going to actually move this down a little bit closer to this other ring. Right. And if we look at the body in this image, right, it gets fatter and then it more slowly tapers to the top. And so I've got one there. Let's go ahead and copy. I'm going to Control and copy this. And then I'm going to move that copy up. All right. And what I may do is say that's going to be my widest point. And then I'm going to just go ahead and start tapering these in. So I've moved it vertically. I'm going to use the number 1 on the keyboard, or right again, I can grab the hand tool here to pull this down so I can reframe it a little bit better. I'm going to hit the letter T, right, to do scale. I'm going to taper this in just a little. Oh, that's going out. I'm going to taper this in just a little bit. And then if I look at this, right, because this taper is so uniform, nothing really exciting happens until right about here. So I'm going to go ahead and then this next circle that I copy, I'm going to say Control, pop this down here, and I'm just going to go into this view for the time being. And I'm going to scale out a little bit so I can see more of the scene. And then I'm going to use the Move tool, and I'm going to lift this one up maybe to about here, because that's maybe about where I want I'm going to want the fins to come in there. And I'm going to then scale this, but I'm going to need to switch my view again. So I'm going to pop back over. And I'm going to scale this down a little bit. I'm going to hit T so I can scale. And I'm going to sneak this not out, but in, and taper it to about there. All right, so you can see that we're starting to get this squid-like form already. It doesn't look absolutely perfect. I'm going to rotate my view a bit. But you can see like it is kind of looking squiddish, which is totally a word, squiddish. All right, so I've got my third one. So this is where we're going to start to put these fins in. And so, so what we're going to need to do, because we have more detail in the sense that, right, there's a very drastic change that's going to happen here. And squid actually have a little bit more of a slope that comes out. It's not quite so abrupt. And so we might mirror that, but we know we need one that's going to be like really pretty far stuck out. And if we look at other images of squid, you can tell these are actually pretty flat too, right? They are fins. They're part of the way that they steer themselves in the water. And so, we're going to need a pretty different cross section. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and copy the circle one more time, hit the letter E, and I'm just going to scoot this up a tiny bit, right? You can see I have, a lot more geometry already in there, and I'm going to taper this just a tiny bit. And what I'm going to do, instead of doing it with the scale tool, I'm going to say this is 191.8. I'm going to make this like just 190 or something like that. Okay, so it still is tapering, but it's just doing it a little bit differently. And then what I'm going to do is pop over to one of these views, and I'm going to adjust this so I can zoom in as much as I can, but still have what would be the entire squid in there. Because, right, I kind of want the top to be maybe about here. And, you know, the widest point on the fins should probably be somewhere in here. So I'm going to go ahead and copy the circle again. And oops, and you'll notice when I did this, it actually popped out and it's the same number. So I'm going to undo that. I'm going to control and make sure it stays in there. So it's circle 5. And now that I've got circle 5, there's a couple of things I could do. And I'm going to work like in a way where we're going to try and get the basics down, like the basic form down, and then we can copy those basic forms and insert them in a different order to try and get this to work. It's a more complex way of working, but you know, the basics are down now. So let's go ahead and say, all right, where do I want this, you know, the width to be widest? Maybe I actually just want it here. So I have like a little bit I can come out and it's just going to sweep out to maybe about here. And then it'll taper back as we go. And the other part is, where do I want that final cap to be? So the other thing is that needs to happen is this is going to start getting really confusing. So I'm going to call this the widest point, right? Or maybe it should be maybe fin point or something like that, right? Because that's what's going to go there. And then I'm going to go ahead and hit Control. I'm going to click and drag. And this fin point 1, I'm just going to rename as top for now. And I'm going to select the top. I'm going to drag this all the way up to where I want the top to be. And I'm going to scale it down some. I'm not going to scale it down all the way, but I'm going to scale it down some. So I'm going to switch my view so I can see the top of this thing. I'm going to select this view. I'm going to hit H. I'm going to rotate, and then I'm going to just rotate so I can see. I'm going to select the top again over here because I selected that whole object. Hit the letter T, and I'm just going to scale this like way down. And you're going to notice that no matter what, I have this like flat surface, which we may not resolve fully in this tutorial, but we'll just get it reasonably close to nothing, because there's ways we can fix this. But again, it's when you go and make things editable and make changes that way. Okay, so we're going to get it reasonably close to like a small, you know, central point. Okay, I'm going to save it now because I haven't saved this yet. You should save it as well. And I'm going to call this squid. Okay. So I've saved it, so now it should be updating and saving. This is a lot of work. We don't want to lose it. Okay, so I've got my fin point and my top. And let's go ahead and look at our fin point. So here's the fin point. What I would like to do is have this stretch, right? In like I really, you know, even if I make even if I turn this into an ellipse, like, so let's go ahead and do that. And I have this radius y. Let's see which one stretches which way. Oh, perfect, right? So even if I stretch this radius out this way, I'm still going to have, what I want is I want this body to remain, I'm going to undo that. I want the body to remain bulbous, but I actually need like a little bit more geometry here to pop these fins out the side. And so with fin point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and do a couple steps that should be interesting. So what we're going to do first is we're going to turn the loft visibility off. Right? What that's going to do is it's going to mean I can see all of my splines, and this is the only spline I'm worried about seeing. So I'm going to click the viewport solo mode. Right? The only thing I need to make sure of is I know which orientation I want this to spread out at, and it should be along the z-axis, right? This blue axis. You can see it's pointing this direction. So we just know we need this extra stuff to happen here. So I've got this one thing selected. I'm going to go to viewport solo, Now, up until this point, we've been working in model mode. In order to edit the points of a spline, we need to shift to points mode. So I'm going to click in points mode. Now, even though I've selected points mode, I still have this orange circle that I can't do anything to. And that's because this is a primitive, and you cannot edit the individual points of a primitive. What you can do, though, now is we can make this editable. Now, to make something editable, there's a couple ways we can do that, but the way to be able to figure out where everything is if we right-click on this object in the hierarchy. You'll see there's a boatload of different options. We're not going to worry about any of them except this one right here, which is Make Editable. You'll note that this is also the letter C on the keyboard. So just to note, once we make something editable, right, I just want you to see right here, we have all these object properties. Here I can adjust intermediate points and do all sorts of fun stuff there. But once I make this editable, this changes, and you'll notice my object properties fundamentally change as well. So what this has done is it's basically given me these 4 points, and it says I have these intermediary points that are uniform, right? That's great. That's what I want. But I only have 4 points that I can manipulate. You'll also notice that this circle starts white and goes blue. There's a direction to every path, and for most of the time it doesn't matter. It only really matters because you can actually use splines as like an animation path, so we can actually animate along a spline, and the direction of animation is going to be based on the direction that the points are going. That's not something that we need to worry about. You'll note that there's this close spline option here. If I uncheck that, you'll see that it actually opens up, right? Because we have our 4 points, and then it basically is, if we say close spline, it's going to close that spline. So what we want to do is we want these 2 points to be moved. And if I have them moved, I have the scale tool selected right now. If any of these tools selected, you'll see that I get an axis now for each point on this thing. 1 point is highlighted. I can actually do multiple points at the same time. And in this case, that's kind of what I want to do. I want to hold down Shift, and I want to select this point as well. And then the easiest way to uniformly move these points is to use the scale tool. So if I hit the letter T, and I just scale along the blue axis now, right, they're both going to move apart from each other. Right? I'm not actually making the point bigger or whatever, but I'm actually moving them apart. And if I only have 1 point selected with the scale tool, it doesn't work quite the same way. Okay. So I'm stretching this out. That's fantastic. Now, what I want, though, is I don't actually want these points to be stretched out without something else, right? With the whole body warping in that way. So I'm going to undo this. What I really need is I need a couple more points here and here in order to say I just want the fins to come out, right? And so to add a point to a spline, there's a couple different ways I can do it. One, I need to go to the Spline pen tool, right? And if I go to the Spline pen tool, you'll see that I can actually click and drag and like warp the edges here, which is kind of cool. Not what I want to do right now. I can hover over the point. I can move these points. I can hover over these handles. And if you've used any Bezier editing tool, you know that, right, you can adjust curves using these handles. If you haven't, it's a little counterintuitive and you kind of figure it out as you go. But if I hold down Control, you'll see I get a plus sign and I get this little slice, right? That basically means I am cutting a line here. You'll note that if I hover over an existing point, I get a minus and I can see a preview of what's going to happen, right? That preview of what's going to happen means that I would be removing a point from the line, and I don't want to do that. So what I want to do is I want to add a point here, and I want to add a point here. And now, one of the things that would be nice is if I could not have to do this 4 times and get them offset in weird ways. So I'm going to undo that because there's a really magical tool here, which is symmetry. If I click Enable Symmetry and then I click on the settings, context is auto. I'm going to say modeling is what I want. And you'll see that it allows me to say what axes do I want to have symmetry in? If I just do X and I hold down Control and click, oops, where did it go? It should have done a second point there. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe this won't work in this setting and I have to do something special. But let's see what I can do. Oh yeah, okay. So you can see how I've got this edge here and here, and maybe that's not working the way I want it to. Nope. Okay, we'll just. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to be able to use the spline pen tool and I want to cut these things. Now, I can use this grid as something of a guide, and I'm going to go ahead and try and match where, right, somewhat close to where these points cross this grid line. So I'm going to click one there, come down here, click one there, and click one there. Okay, so now I have all these additional points. So now what I can do is I can use either my move tool. There's also this live selection tool, which I can use to select both of those points, or I can use the move tool to select them as well. The live selection tool is nice because it's more like a brush, and so you can select a bunch of points. You can just I can just click and drag, right, and select multiple points that way. And again, if you want to select multiple points, you hold down Shift. If you need to deselect a point, like say I've selected these 3 points on accident and I don't want to redo it all, if you hold down Control and click and drag, it will deselect the point you do not want selected. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and hit T so I can scale, and now I can scale, right, my fins out. And suddenly I've got like a much more interesting model. Now, one thing I need to check is how that looks as the geometry. And honestly, it looks pretty squid-like already. You can see that even with just that one point and that one little bit of additional geometry, now I've got something that suddenly looks very much like a squid. All right. Now, if I want to have, right, finer detail, if I want these curves to be, maybe I want this to be a little bit tighter or shrink in a little bit faster, or, you know, I want to have this end before it gets to the tip, which actually I don't. I can now take this fin point and I can hold down Control, click and drag in my hierarchy, drop it in there. And right now this fin point 1 is, you know, close is actually between the top and this one, right? So if I use my move tool, if I was to be like, oh, I actually want this to be down, you'll see what starts to happen if I get these in the wrong order, right? What I really want to do is I want to pull this up, you know, and you all could do, you know, whatever else. But so if I pull this up a little bit and hit T to scale, and then, you know, scale this in just a little bit in this direction, right? I could really start to have a bit more control over the shape of these different splines. And something else I just noticed that I want you to notice, right? Did anybody see what happened? I give pause for time to respond as though people will respond to me on the internet in anything other than a comment section, right? Why is this geometry doing this? Right? It's because I still had these 2 points selected. I did not have the entire object selected because I'm still in points mode, right? So if you see weird things happening like this, that means that I'm in the wrong mode. I'm not moving the entire spline up and down. I'm just moving these 2 points on that spline up and down. So I'm going to go ahead and undo those movements. And I'm going to switch from points mode back to model mode, which is the full cube here. I'm going to hit the letter E to move this. And now if I stretch this up, right? I've got a much different outcome from what I've done. And you can see that, right, the entire thing is like really bulbous because it's right the same size. And now what I could do is I could scale this entire thing down. So if I hit the letter T and I scale this in both directions down, let's see what that looks like. Right now I've got something that's a little bit smoother. I could add, right, I could crank it way down if I wanted those to be like flared out a little bit. I could bring this up if I want that the top of the head to be, or body, whatever it is, to be a little more bulbous. But I have, you know, a fair amount of freedom. Now I do have this like chunk of geometry here where I intentionally had those 2 points close together. So let's see. Fin point, and then I think circle 4 was this other one. I'm going to hit the letter E, and I'm just going to pull this up just a little bit, right? Because that allows me to kind of, you know, if I go, the closer I go here, right, I can get that much harder edge between these two pieces, these two lofts, or these two splines, right? So I could, you know, I can get to a point where I'm going to invert things and, you know, chaos is going to ensue. We don't want that. But this again, right now I have the ability to make, you know, some fine-tuned adjustments in here. Now, if I, you know, what I don't want to do, right, is switch the order of these. This is what happens if things get out of order. If you notice your model starts looking really totally crazy and insane, it's because these are not in the order that you want them to be in. It's best if you allow them to have that numbering, so you can be like, oh yeah, number 4 is in the right place. And then, you know, have a few key points. Like I could probably call this first circle start, or base or something like that, and top, right? So we have some idea of where these things are in the body. And I might actually move this circle 4 down just a touch because I actually like it to be a little bit more fanned out. Okay. So we've got the body of the squid pretty much done. Let's go ahead and collapse this loft and change the name to body. And then let's go ahead and, where's my skirt? Why is my skirt not showing up? I'm going to go ahead and save this. Oh, so why is my skirt not showing up? My skirt's not showing up because I have viewport solo on. Let's go ahead and turn viewport solo off. And so now it looks like maybe I want my skirt to be just like a little bit bigger in order to match the scale of the body. So let's go ahead, and we have our skirt selected. If I could either scale the whole thing up, or I could go down and in this case, because I have those 4, or, you know, because I have a bunch of things here, I don't want to have to go scale each of one of those individually. So I'm going to go ahead and go to coordinates for my loft object itself. And let's say we want to scale definitely the X and Z. Let's make this 1.2, and we'll do 1.2 for this as well. And then I can scoot this up a little bit maybe, and let's get these not so they intersect, but so they almost intersect. All right. So I've got this thing going, and you'll note, right, I have fewer rotational segments here on the body than I do on the skirt. And this is going to be pretty jagged and faceted if I leave it this way. So let's go to our body, go to the object tab, and let's at least make this 32 or maybe 48. Right? We don't need it to be 100 like this other one. But you can see we have a little bit here. Something else to note is that there is a little bit of like intersection and weirdness happening here because of the scale of this, of the inset flower. And so it would be flower 1. So I might try and tweak one of these radii to see if I can get it to be a little bit smaller and maybe clean that up. And it looks like if I set it to, it was like 332, seemed to do the job. and make it so that there aren't those weird intersecting geometry things happening there. I still have a little bit of it there. And those things are going to be problematic if I don't change those. So maybe I can scale this whole one down just a little bit more. So if I hit the letter T and zoom out just a touch, and scale in both of these directions, let's see what happens here. Let's just pull this in just a touch and rotate my view. And then all I'm looking for is those any weird lines that are poking through in any of these places. And it looks like I've cleaned all of that up at this point, right? So these are all things to just be very aware of as you're modeling. Sometimes they're hard to see, and you won't see it until you start to render something and you're like, why does this material look so bizarre? Okay, so let's go ahead and save our work here, and we're going to stop this section of the tutorial, and then we will come back and work on tentacles.